The military K9 hit the ER doors at full speed, and the entire emergency ward froze. Doctors pressed against walls. A nurse dropped her clipboard. Someone screamed. The scarred Belgian Malinois moved through the chaos like he owned it, ears flat, eyes scanning, until he found her. Not the chief, not the security guard reaching for his radio. Her, a quiet nurse standing near Bay 4 holding a chart nobody had asked her opinion about. The dog stopped, lowered his massive head, and rested it against her knee like he'd walked 1,000 miles to get there. And the war-hardened handler, watching from the doorway, went completely pale. If you've never seen a trained military dog chew someone in a crowded room, you don't understand what that moment means. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow Evelyn's story all the way to the end, because what this dog knew about her will change everything you think you understand about the people being overlooked around you. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it actually started. Redstone Memorial Hospital sat at the edge of Ashford, Colorado, the kind of mountain town that felt like it belonged to a different century until a trauma came through the doors and reminded everyone exactly what century it was. The ER operated on controlled chaos, 12-hour shifts, rotating staff, the low hum of monitors that blended into the background noise of your brain until something spiked and pulled you back to full attention. Evelyn Marsh had worked those floors for 6 years. She knew every sound the building made, every shortcut through the supply corridor, every attending physician who would listen, and everyone who wouldn't. Most of them wouldn't. She was 38, lean and quiet, in the way that some people mistook for passiveness. Brown hair pulled back. No jewelry on shift. Her scrubs were always a half size too large because she'd bought them during a period when her weight had dropped after a rough deployment year, and she'd never bothered to replace them. She moved through the ER efficiently, without the kind of performance that made people stop and notice you. That was a deliberate choice she'd made a long time ago, in a life that most of her colleagues didn't know existed. The morning the dog arrived started like any other. Evelyn clocked in at 6:45, picked up her patient assignments from the board, and stood at the nursing station with a cup of coffee that was already going cold while she reviewed the overnight notes. 3 admissions from a highway accident, 2 cardiac holds, 1 pediatric respiratory case the night team had flagged as borderline. She read carefully. She always read carefully. That habit had been drilled into her somewhere very different from a hospital corridor, and it had never left. Marsh. The voice came from behind her, flat, dismissive, the specific tone of someone who had decided before speaking that the conversation wasn't worth their full attention. Dr. Garrett Hollis, chief of emergency medicine at Redstone Memorial, walked past her without stopping. He was 51, silver-haired, the kind of man who collected credentials the way other people collected grievances. The Weston chart. You flagged a medication concern last night. I did, Evelyn said. His renal panel from yesterday afternoon showed. I reviewed it. His creatinine trended up overnight. If we don't adjust the dosing on the I said I reviewed it. He stopped walking but didn't turn around. I've been practicing emergency medicine for 22 years, Marsh. If I need your input on a pharmaceutical decision, I will ask for it. Do you understand that? There was a beat, just one. Yes, she said. He walked on. A younger nurse, Petra, who'd been pretending to restock the station beside her, kept her eyes down and didn't say anything. Evelyn turned back to her chart and made a small notation in the margin, the kind that would be there if anyone needed to look at it later. She had a system for that. She'd had one for years. By 9 o'clock, the morning was running hard. A construction worker came in with a laceration that went deeper than the foreman who'd called it in understood, requiring a vascular consult. An elderly woman arrived by ambulance with a probable hip fracture and significant confusion that suggested something more complicated than the fall she was describing. Evelyn managed both, coordinated the imaging on the hip case, and caught an error in the IV order for the vascular patient before it reached pharmacy. She didn't announce the catch. She simply corrected it, documented it, and moved on. That was the pattern. Catch it. Fix it. Don't expect anyone to notice. Around 10:30, the charge nurse, a compact man named Russell Dade, who had 15 years on the floor and a talent for staying precisely neutral in every situation, pulled her into the break room. "Close the door," he said. She did. He stood with his arms crossed, not meeting her eyes directly. Hollis submitted a staffing reassignment this morning. To where? Overnight observation, long-term monitoring ward. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The long-term ward was where the ER sent patients who needed monitoring but not active intervention. It was quiet, procedurally simple, and staffed by nurses who either preferred that pace or had been redirected there for reasons no one stated plainly. It was not where you put someone with her skill set, unless you were trying to move them without calling it a demotion. Did he give a reason? Russell finally looked at her. Team fit. She nodded once. There was nothing to say to that. Team fit was the phrase that covered everything that couldn't be said out loud. She pushed back. She caught things people didn't want caught. She asked questions in rooms where the expectation was silence. She took her coffee cup from the table and rinsed it in the small sink without speaking. Evelyn. It's fine, she said. It wasn't fine, but making it someone else's problem wouldn't change the paperwork Hollis had already filed. I'll pick up the overnight schedule starting Monday. She went back to the floor and finished her shift without incident. The reassignment took effect the following week. The observation ward was quieter than she was used to. A long hallway of rooms, beeping monitors, the occasional adjustment of a drip or a position check. The nurses there were kind and competent and utterly baffled by what she was doing among them. She didn't explain. She did the work, kept her documentation exact, and spent her breaks reading updated protocols in the small staff lounge at the end of the hall. On Thursday of that same week, a veteran named Roy Callahan was admitted for post-surgical monitoring following an elective knee procedure. He was 64, former Army, the kind of man who used as few words as possible and meant every one of them. His intake form listed a service dog under approved accompaniments, and when they brought him up from recovery, the dog came with him. Evelyn was doing a routine check in the room 2 doors down when she heard the soft sound of nails on the linoleum. She turned. The Belgian Malinois was maybe 80 pounds, dark-muzzled, with a scar that ran along his left shoulder and disappeared under his working vest. He was moving with the controlled, deliberate pace of a dog that had been trained in environments a lot more demanding than a hospital hallway. His handler, a younger man named Dennis Farrow, who'd come in with the patient's family, had him on a short lead and was clearly surprised by where the dog was pulling. The dog stopped in front of Evelyn and looked at her. Not the curious, sniffing investigation of a pet. Something more direct than that. He held eye contact for 3 full seconds, then pushed his nose briefly against her left hand, the one that carried a faint, old scar along the knuckle line, and sat. Dennis stared. He doesn't do that. Does what? She asked. Voluntarily greet. He doesn't. Atlas, heel. The dog didn't move. Dennis looked genuinely unsettled. Ma'am, I apologize. He's been through a lot recently. He had to retire early from service and he doesn't normally approach. He's fine, Evelyn said. She looked down at the dog. Atlas. She crouched slowly in the way you approach a working dog, not reaching first, letting him read her posture, keeping her movement unhurried. He leaned his head into her palm when she finally extended it. How long was he in service? 5 years, 2 deployments. Dennis was watching her hands, the way she positioned herself. You have experience with working dogs? Some, she said. She stood, asked about Mr. Callahan's pain levels and fluid intake, completed the check, and moved on. It wasn't until she was halfway through charting that she realized her hands had been shaking slightly. Not from fear, from something older and harder to name. Friday brought a complication nobody saw coming except her. Roy Callahan was 2 days post-surgery and scheduled for discharge assessment when his vitals began a subtle shift. Subtle was the exact right word, the kind of change that didn't trigger an automated alert, that read as within acceptable range if you scanned quickly and moved on. His oxygen saturation dropped 2% over 90 minutes. His resting heart rate increased by 12 beats per minute over the same window. His skin color hadn't changed, and he wasn't reporting pain beyond the surgical site, but the rate of change bothered her. She ran the trending numbers herself, pulling the full monitoring log instead of relying on the hourly snapshot. Then she checked his surgical notes and found what she was looking for: an annotation about tourniquet time during the procedure, longer than standard, and a notation from the anesthesiologist that his circulation recovery had been slightly delayed on the table. She called the on-call physician, Dr. Nadia Osei, and laid out what she was seeing. Osei was thorough, the kind of doctor who actually listened, and she came up to the ward within 8 minutes. She examined Callahan, reviewed the trend data Evelyn had printed, and ordered a stat ultrasound. Deep vein thrombosis. Early stage, but developing fast. If it traveled, they were looking at a pulmonary embolism in a 64-year-old man with a compromised cardiovascular history. Osei ordered anticoagulation immediately. "Good catch," she said quietly as she passed Evelyn in the hallway. "That was a good catch." "He's a veteran," Evelyn said, as if that explained why she'd looked twice. It didn't explain it. The real explanation lived somewhere further back, in the ability to monitor a situation without being told what you were looking for, to read change in an environment that appeared stable, to trust your own pattern recognition even when everyone around you suggested the pattern didn't exist. She'd learned that somewhere other than nursing school. On Saturday morning, 2 men arrived at the hospital's administrative entrance and asked to speak with human resources. They were not dressed like HR visitors. They wore civilian clothes that fit slightly wrong, the way professional attire does when it's placed over a posture shaped by years of uniform. One of them carried a leather folio and spoke with the precise, economical language of federal government. They identified themselves to the front desk as representatives from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. They asked for Evelyn Marsh. The administrator at the desk, who later described the interaction to 3 different colleagues with increasing dramatic embellishment, had to look Evelyn up in the system because she hadn't heard the name before. The observation ward wasn't the kind of place that generated stories. By the time the message reached the ward, Evelyn was in the middle of a dressing change on an elderly post-fracture patient. She read the note Petra, who'd been temporarily assigned to cover a gap shift upstairs, had carried up in person because she thought hand-delivering it seemed appropriate given the circumstances. Evelyn read it twice, folded it, put it in her pocket. "Everything okay?" Petra asked. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Will you finish the dressing for me?" She walked to the staff restroom at the end of the hall, ran cold water over her wrists, an old habit, pressure management, and looked at herself in the mirror for exactly 10 seconds. Her face didn't give her much. It never had. That was something she'd worked at for a long time, the skill of keeping the surface still while everything underneath was making rapid calculations. DODIG office. 2 investigators, asking for her specifically. She thought about the drive-in this morning, the way Atlas had greeted her again in the hallway near Roy Callahan's room, the way Dennis Farrow had watched her hands. She thought about a storage unit in Durango with a fireproof box in it that contained certain documents she had never shown to anyone. She dried her hands and went downstairs. The 2 investigators introduced themselves as Agent Lowell Dane and Agent Charisse Vaught. They had a conference room reserved. She didn't know the hospital even had one on this floor. And they sat across from her with the folio open between them and a recorder that Dane turned on without asking permission, which told her something about how this conversation was being classified. "Ms. Marsh," Vaught began, "we're conducting an investigation into the operations of a contractor organization called Meridian K9 Solutions. You may have heard of them." Evelyn said nothing. They held a contract with the United States Army from 2014 through 2019, providing veterinary clearances and rehabilitation services for retired military working dogs. Vaught slid a photograph across the table, aerial view of a facility she recognized. "You worked adjacent to that program during your service." "I was an Army combat medic," Evelyn said. "I worked with MWD units during 2 deployments. And after your second deployment, stateside, Fort Keller, 2017. Dane leaned forward slightly. "You filed an internal complaint with the MWD Program Oversight Office in October of that year." "Yes." "That complaint was closed without action." "Yes." "And you were separated from service approximately 4 months later." The room was quiet. The recorder's small red light blinked steadily. "Medical separation?" Evelyn said. "It's documented." Vaught and Dane exchanged a look that was too brief to read fully, but long enough to tell her they had already reviewed the documentation and had an opinion about it. "Ms. Marsh," Vaught said carefully, "we have reason to believe that Meridian K9 Solutions falsified veterinary clearances on at least 37 working dogs over a 5-year period. Dogs that were cleared as fit for service or adoption despite documented injuries that should have disqualified them. Some of those dogs experienced serious complications. Some didn't survive." She paused. "We believe you have evidence relevant to this investigation." Evelyn kept her expression level. "What kind of evidence are you looking for?" "You tell us," Dane said. That was the moment she made a decision. Not an impulsive one. She'd been running through the calculations since she read the note in her pocket, but a decisive one, the kind that has consequences in every direction, and you choose it anyway because the alternative is worse. "I'll need to make a phone call first," she said. Neither investigator objected. She stepped into the hallway, pulled out her personal cell phone, not the work one, and dialed a number she knew by memory and used rarely. It rang 4 times before a man's voice answered with a single word. "Yeah. It's Marsh," she said. "They found me." A long pause. "DODIG?" "2 of them, here at the hospital." "Are they hostile?" She thought about Vaught's careful tone, the precision of the questions. "No. I think they're legitimate." "Okay." Another pause, the sound of movement on the other end, like someone standing up. "Do you still have the box?" "Yes." "Then you know what to do." She ended the call and stood in the corridor for a moment, watching a transport aide wheel a patient toward radiology, watching the normal machinery of the hospital running around her like she wasn't standing in the middle of something that had been building for 8 years. Roy Callahan's door was open down the hall, and she could see Atlas lying on the floor beside the bed, his chin resting on the edge of the mattress, his dark eyes open and watchful. She went back into the conference room. "I have documentation," she told them. "It's not here, but I can get it within 48 hours. Vaught wrote something in the folio. We'll need to move quickly. There are others involved in this investigation who are aware that we've located you. We can't guarantee—" The door to the conference room opened. Hollis stood in the doorway. He took in the investigators, the recorder, Evelyn sitting across from them, and his face moved through several different expressions before settling on something cold and controlled. "What's going on?" he said. Neither investigator responded. Evelyn looked at him steadily. "A meeting." "In my hospital?" "In a conference room," she said. "Sir?" Something crossed his face that she couldn't fully read. Not just the territorial irritation she expected, but something more specific, something that looked, for just a fraction of a second, like recognition. He pulled the door shut. She watched the space where he'd been standing. Dane followed her gaze. "You know him well?" "He's the chief of emergency," she said. "He moved me to a different ward last week." Vaught's pen had stopped moving. "On what grounds?" "Team fit," Evelyn said. The 2 investigators looked at each other again. This time she caught enough of it to understand that Hollis had just become part of a question they were now adding to their list. Outside in the hallway, just visible through the small window set in the conference room door, she could see the corridor was empty. Hollis had gone. She thought about the fireproof box, the medical records inside it, the photographs and the timestamps, and the veterinary reports with the altered numbers. She'd memorized those numbers years ago, could still recite them the way you remember the face of someone you once sat next to during something that changed you both. She thought about Atlas, 2 floors up, lying beside a man whose blood had been quietly trying to kill him until she'd caught it. She thought about the expression on Hollis's face when he'd opened that door, not the anger, but the thing underneath the anger, and felt something in her chest settle into a particular kind of readiness that she hadn't needed in a long time, but had never once lost. 48 hours, she said again. Vaught nodded and reached across to stop the recorder. Evelyn sat very still and said nothing about the fact that 48 hours might be more time than they had, because whoever else was watching this investigation was now watching her, inside a building where she had just been moved to the most isolated ward on the property, by a man whose face had told her something the moment he'd opened that door. She was going to need to be very careful. She was going to need to be very careful about who else had been in that hallway. She walked out of that conference room carrying the weight of a decision that couldn't be undone, and the first thing she did was go check on a patient. Not because she was avoiding what had just happened, because Roy Callahan's anticoagulation had been running for less than 6 hours, and his last vitals check had been 40 minutes ago, and that was simply what came next. That was how she had survived the last 8 years, by doing what came next completely, before allowing herself to look at the larger shape of things. Atlas lifted his head when she stepped into the room. Roy was awake, sitting up at maybe 30 degrees, the television on but muted. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had spent decades reading people and had already formed an opinion about her that he wasn't going to share unless asked. "How's the pain?" she said. "Manageable." He watched her check the IV line and the monitor readout. "Dennis told me what you did, catching the clot." "The monitor caught it. I just ran the trend." "That's not what Dennis said." She didn't respond to that. She noted his oxygen saturation, made a small adjustment to his pillow position that would help with circulation, and wrote in his chart. "You were a medic," Roy said. It wasn't a question. She looked up briefly. "Combat medic. 2 deployments." "Which branch?" "Army." He nodded once, like that confirmed something. "I was Army, 26 years. He paused. "You know what gave you away?" "The way I crouched," she said. "Nobody crouches like that in a hospital. That's a working dog approach. Took me a second to place it." His eyes were steady on her face. "Atlas doesn't greet people. He hasn't greeted anyone in about 8 months, not since they pulled him from his last handler. Whatever he read in you, it wasn't nothing." Evelyn set the chart down. "He's a good dog. He's a better judge of character than most people I've met with graduate degrees," Roy said. "Which brings me to asking why a combat medic with working dog experience is running vitals checks in a long-term observation ward." The question sat between them. From the hallway came the sound of a cart being wheeled past, someone's voice giving a brief instruction, the ordinary noise of the floor continuing without her. "Staff rotation," she said. Roy looked at her for a long moment. "Right," he said finally. She picked up the chart and left him with Atlas watching her from the floor, those dark eyes following her out with the same unreadable attention the dog had shown her from the first moment. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident on the surface. Underneath the surface was a different matter. She did her rounds. She documented. She answered a question from a new aide about procedure for repositioning a non-ambulatory patient. She ate half a granola bar in the staff lounge at 2:15 and threw the rest away because her appetite had been replaced by a low-grade electric alertness that she recognized from a long time ago, the feeling of standing in a place where multiple things were about to happen and only some of them were visible yet. At 3:40, she passed the nursing station and noticed that the administrator's computer screen was showing the staff directory, open to her profile. The administrator, a woman named Candace Briggs, who had been at Redstone for 11 years and had a talent for institutional loyalty, minimized the window quickly when Evelyn walked by. Evelyn kept walking and did not change her pace. She filed that away alongside the expression on Hollis's face and the way Vaught's pen had stopped moving, and she let it settle into the part of her mind that organized information without announcing that it was doing so. At 4:15, Dennis Farrow found her in the corridor. He was agitated in the controlled way of someone who'd been trained not to show agitation, which meant it was coming out in compressed, efficient sentences and a posture slightly too rigid for a casual conversation. "The 2 men who came in this morning," he said, "federal investigators." "Yes." "They spoke to Roy before they left." He glanced down the hallway. "He didn't tell me what they said, but he asked me to stay close to Atlas tonight." Evelyn processed that. Roy, who used as few words as possible, had given Dennis a specific instruction about the dog. Not about himself. About the dog. "Where are you staying?" she said. "My cousin's place, 15 minutes out, but Roy's asking me to. I think he wants me to sleep here." Dennis ran a hand over his jaw. He's not the kind of man who asks for things. So when he asked, "Stay," she said, "I'll clear it with the charge nurse." Russell Dade, predictably, was not enthusiastic. The hospital's policy on visitor overnight stays was specific and involved paperwork that required an attending physician's signature and a reason that fit into a particular set of documented categories. Evelyn walked him through the argument methodically: service animal continuity of care, patient psychological distress, the legitimate therapeutic role of the dog in a veteran's recovery. And when he still hesitated, she added the fact that Roy Callahan had flagged his vitals less than 8 hours ago, which meant his status was still acute enough to justify flexibility. Russell signed off. She found Dennis in the hallway and told him, and he nodded with the particular relief of someone who'd been prepared to argue longer and was surprised not to have to. She drove home at 6:30. She lived 20 minutes from the hospital in a rental unit on the second floor of a 2-story house owned by a retired schoolteacher who had a herb garden in the backyard and never asked intrusive questions, which Evelyn had considered a primary qualification when she'd chosen the place. The apartment was small and clean and contained almost nothing unnecessary. Books in one corner. A good kitchen knife set, because cooking was the thing she did when her mind needed to move, but her body needed to stay still. A folded flag in a shadow box on the wall. She hadn't mounted it, just rested it against the surface, the way you might set something down somewhere temporarily that slowly becomes permanent. She made rice and vegetables while her phone sat face up on the counter, and she thought about the storage unit in Durango. The fireproof box had been packed 8 years ago, during the 3 weeks between when she filed the complaint and when the separation papers came through. She'd understood by then that the complaint wasn't going anywhere. She'd understood it probably on day 2, but she'd completed the process anyway because doing something correctly, even when it was going to be ignored, had felt important to her at the time. Still did. But she'd also understood that completing the process and getting ignored wasn't the end of the thing. It was just the pause before the next phase. So she'd made copies of everything she'd been able to access before access was restricted: medical records, veterinary clearance reports, her own personal logs from the months she'd spent adjacent to the Meridian K9 program, and 3 emails from a senior program officer who hadn't been careful enough about what he put in writing. The originals of those emails existed on a server she no longer had access to, but the printouts existed in a fireproof box in Durango, Colorado, in a storage unit rented under a name she'd used legally for 14 months after her separation and then changed back. The system had been designed to make that kind of preservation difficult. She had made it anyway. She cleaned her dishes, changed out of her work clothes, and sat at the small table by the window for a long time doing nothing visible. The question was how quickly someone inside the investigation might share with someone outside it. Vaught and Dane had been careful, professional, apparently legitimate, but every investigation had leak points, and whatever network had covered up the Meridian program for 5 years had demonstrated a capacity for institutional reach that she had not forgotten. She set her alarm for 5:15 and went to bed, and lay awake for 45 minutes before her body finally decided the alertness could stand down for a few hours. She was back at the hospital by 6:50. The first thing she noticed was that Roy Callahan's room was dark. Not dark as in lights off for sleep, dark in the way rooms get when they're empty and haven't been attended to yet. The blinds still closed from overnight, no motion in the space. Atlas was not visible through the narrow gap in the doorway. She walked faster. The room was empty. Bed stripped, personal items gone. Monitoring equipment disconnected and pushed to the wall in the hurried but functional way that indicated a rapid transfer rather than a planned discharge. On the dry erase board where patient information was written, Roy Callahan's name had been erased and replaced with nothing. She went to the nursing station. The overnight nurse, a young man named Tobias, who had been working at Redstone for less than a year, looked up with the expression of someone who'd been waiting to have a conversation he wasn't sure how to have. "Mr. Callahan was transferred at 4:40 this morning," he said. "To where?" Tobias picked up the chart and turned it toward her. The transfer destination field showed a facility she knew by name, Veterans Medical Center in Colorado Springs, 2.5 hours south. The authorization signature was Hollis's. Evelyn stared at the signature. "Who requested the transfer?" she said. "It came through administrative," Tobias said. "I assumed it was coordinated with the family, but—" He paused. The dog handler, the younger one, he was pretty upset when they told him. He said nobody called him and Roy didn't ask for it. "What time did Dennis leave?" "Around 4. He fell asleep in the chair, and I think he—" I told him to go get breakfast. He was gone maybe 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Someone had been watching for a window. Evelyn kept her voice level. Who came to arrange the transport? Two orderlies I didn't recognize. They said they were from the transport service the hospital contracts with. Tobias was young enough that this had seemed normal to him when it was happening and was only now beginning to seem less normal under her questions. Is something wrong? No, she said. Thank you. She walked to the end of the hallway and stood at the window looking out at the parking lot while her mind ran the calculation fast and cold. Roy Callahan, whose blood she had caught quietly trying to kill him, who had been stable but not yet cleared, had been moved at 4:40 in the morning on a transfer authorized by Hollis, the same man who had been at that conference room door 12 hours earlier with recognition in his face. A man in the middle of anticoagulation therapy transferred before the treatment window was complete. She turned around and walked to the charge desk and looked up the direct number for the Veterans Medical Center in Colorado Springs. She called from the ward phone, identified herself as a nurse calling for a patient welfare check on a recent transfer, and was put on hold for 4 minutes before a very tired-sounding admissions clerk came back and told her they had no record of a Roy Callahan being admitted or expected. She hung up the phone. For a moment, she just stood there with her hand still on the receiver. Then she called Dennis Farrow's cell number from her personal phone. He picked up on the second ring, and from the sound of his voice, he hadn't slept. They told me Colorado Springs, he said before she could explain why she was calling. He's not there, she said. A silence. What do you mean he's not there? I called. They don't have a record. She kept her voice quiet. Dennis, where would Roy want to go if he felt he needed to disappear? Dennis was quiet for a moment. He's got a brother, Pueblo. Address? I have it. Why would... He stopped. She heard him understand it in real time, the processing of it, the shift from confused to alarmed. Is he safe? Is Roy... I don't know yet, she said honestly. Call the brother, right now. Don't use the hospital number to call me back. Use this number. She gave him her personal cell. If Roy picks up, tell him to stay where he is and to call the investigators. She hesitated. You have their card? Roy has it. Okay, go. She ended the call and stood in the corridor for 3 seconds, then went to find Russell Dade. Russell was at his desk with a coffee and the look of a man who had arrived hoping for a quiet Saturday and was already sensing that wasn't what he was going to get. She laid out what she knew quickly and without inflection, because Russell responded better to facts than to urgency. When she finished, he sat back. The transfer paperwork has Hollis's signature. I know. Evelyn, if you're implying that the chief of emergency medicine, I'm not implying anything, she said. I'm telling you that a patient in active anticoagulation therapy was transferred to a facility that has no record of receiving him in the middle of the night on paperwork signed by a physician who was present at a federal investigation meeting less than 12 hours earlier. You can draw your own lines. Russell was quiet. He wasn't a man who moved quickly or dramatically, but he wasn't a man who ignored things, and that was why she'd come to him. What do you need? He said. I need you to pull the transfer request and find out who initiated it at the administrative level. Don't go through Hollis's office. He nodded slowly. She left him to it and went back to her rounds, because the other patients on the ward still needed their checks done, and she would not let what was happening upend that. This was something she had learned a long time ago, and it was not always easy, the ability to hold multiple urgent things without letting any of them collapse under the weight of the others. She was checking an IV line in room 6 when her personal phone buzzed in her pocket. Dennis. She stepped into the hallway to answer. He's in Pueblo, Dennis said, at his brother's. He got there around 5:30 this morning. A short pause. He said a man came into his room at 4:30 and told him the federal investigators had recommended he be moved for his own safety, that they'd coordinated a transport. Roy said something felt wrong, but he was still groggy from the overnight medication, and he went with it. Is he okay physically? Yeah, his brother used to be a paramedic. He's checking him. Dennis's voice had the edge of someone managing anger very carefully. The dog wasn't in the room when they moved Roy. I had Atlas with me. If he had been... I know, she said. What do we do? Does Roy still have the investigator's card? He does. Tell him to call Dane directly. Tell him exactly what happened and what time. She paused. Dennis? Don't bring him back here yet. Yeah, Dennis said. I got that. She put the phone back in her pocket. The morning continued to move around her. The shift change, the medication runs, the particular institutional rhythm of a hospital that never fully slowed. And she did her work inside it and thought about timing. Whoever had authorized that transfer had done it within 12 hours of the conference room meeting. That meant either Hollis had made a call immediately after leaving that doorway, or someone else had received a communication from a watcher inside the hospital and acted fast. Either way, the message was clear enough. The investigation's arrival had triggered a response, and the response had been to remove the one person in the building whose presence there already connected everything: an Army veteran, a retired K-9 handler, lying in the same ward as a nurse who had once filed a complaint against the program that had injured his dog. That was not a coincidence. That was a thread. And someone had just pulled it. She went through her shift with a focused, narrow attention, the kind that looks from the outside like calm. Around noon, Russell found her in the medication room. The transfer request, he said. He had a folded printout in his hand. It was initiated through the hospital's administrative system at 3:14 in the morning. The login credentials belonged to Candace Briggs. Candace Briggs? Who had been looking at Evelyn's staff profile on her computer yesterday afternoon? Was Candace here at 3:14? Evelyn asked. She clocked out at 11:30 Friday night. Russell's voice was flat. Her credentials were used while she was not physically in the building. Someone used her login. That would appear to be what happened. Did you document this? I'm documenting it right now. He looked at her. Evelyn, this is something larger than I can manage at the nursing charge level. I know, she said. I'm going to call the investigators this afternoon. Please do it before this afternoon, he said. She called Vaught from the stairwell at 12:40. Vaught answered on the third ring, and Evelyn laid out everything: Roy's transfer, the false destination, the 3:14 login, Dennis's account of what Roy had been told. She spoke without hurrying, gave only what she'd confirmed rather than what she suspected, and waited. Vaught's response was brief. Don't go anywhere. I'm at work. Stay at work. We'll be there within 2 hours. A pause. Ms. Marsh, does anyone at that hospital know you've been in contact with us this morning? Evelyn thought about Russell. One person I trust. Keep it that way. She went back to the ward. The afternoon was the hardest part. The waiting inside the normal, the performance of routine while everything underneath was moving. She changed dressings and monitored vitals and answered a question from a physician she didn't know well about a patient whose chart she'd flagged, and she did all of it completely because that was the only way she knew how to do things. At 1:50, she was at the nursing station when she heard the elevator. Not the sound of the elevator arriving, the sound of the hallway changing, the particular way ambient noise alters when people enter a space with purpose, and everyone in it unconsciously registers that shift before they understand it consciously. She turned. Vaught and Dane came off the elevator, followed by two people she hadn't seen before, a man in a suit and a woman in military dress uniform, the insignia of Army Criminal Investigation Division visible on her collar. They moved through the hallway with a directness that caused every person in their path to step aside without being asked. Behind them, at a remove that maintained separation while communicating alignment, came a Redstone Memorial security officer. Not the usual weekend staff, but the director of security, a former state police officer named Frank Cardulo, who she had spoken to exactly twice in 6 years, and who looked like he had been briefed on something 30 minutes ago and was still processing it. Evelyn stood still at the nursing station and waited for them to reach her. Vaught stopped 2 feet away. We need a room, she said. The family consultation room is empty, Evelyn said. They moved, all of them together. Evelyn at the center of it, not flanked. That wasn't the posture, but oriented toward the way a conversation orients around whoever has the information everyone else needs. She was 3 steps from the consultation room door when she heard Hollis's voice from the cross corridor behind her. What the hell is going on up here? She didn't turn around. The CID officer did. And whatever she said to Hollis in the next 10 seconds was said quietly enough that Evelyn couldn't hear the words, only his response, which was a single, strangled syllable, something between a protest and a question. Then silence. Evelyn went into the consultation room and sat down. Vought set a recording device on the table and looked at her with the particular directness of someone who had been doing this long enough to dispense with preamble. "We pulled Roy Callahan's actual transport records," she said. "The vehicle that left Redstone Memorial at 4:40 this morning was not affiliated with the hospital's contracted service. We have plates." Dane set a photograph on the table. A vehicle. A license plate. "Do you recognize this?" Evelyn looked at it carefully. She didn't recognize it. But the plate was from a county in New Mexico, and the vehicle was a gray cargo van, unmarked, the kind that could belong to anybody, and therefore belong to no one you'd trust. "No," she said. "We didn't expect you to." Vought leaned forward. "Ms. Marsh, someone inside this hospital provided your name, your ward assignment, and Roy Callahan's room number to people who have reason to want this investigation disrupted. We believe that someone also accessed this hospital's administrative system in the early hours of this morning to authorize a transfer that was designed to remove a witness." A pause. "Roy Callahan was a witness, but so are you." The room was quiet except for the building's ventilation and the distant, ordinary sounds of the hospital doing what hospitals do. "I know," Evelyn said. "We'd like to establish a protective protocol for you starting tonight." She looked at Vought, and then at Dane, and then at the photograph of the gray van, and she thought about 8 years of documentation in a fireproof box, about a dog who had walked across a crowded emergency ward to find her, about a man who had been moved out of his bed in the dark while his handler was eating breakfast, about the way Hollis had looked at her in the conference room doorway with something in his eyes that was not just territorial anger. "Before we talk about that," she said, "I need to tell you something about Dr. Hollis." Everyone in the room went still. "He was connected to the Fort Keller program. Not officially. His name won't be in the main records." She placed her hands flat on the table. "But I have documentation that connects him to a consulting arrangement with Meridian K9 Solutions. He provided civilian medical oversight opinions on a subset of dog clearances for 18 months, starting in 2016. She held Vaught's gaze. "He was the one who recommended my complaint be closed without review. I didn't know that when I started working here. I found out 8 months after I took the job." Dane's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. "And you stayed," Vought said. "It wasn't an accusation, it was the question underneath the statement." "I needed the documentation to be somewhere safe before I moved again," Evelyn said. "And I wanted to know who else was connected to him before I surfaced." Vought sat back. Outside the consultation room, somewhere down the ward, a monitor alarm sounded and was attended to and went quiet, and the hospital continued its work without pausing for any of this. "The box," Dane said. "Durango." "Yes." "We're going to need it tonight." "I know," she said. "I'll need a vehicle I can trust." Vought nodded. "We'll provide one." It should have felt like a relief. The thing she had been carrying, that box, those years, the careful preservation of evidence that she had maintained through 2 job changes and a move across state lines, was finally going to move to hands that could do something with it. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like the moment before a door opens when you're not certain what's on the other side, and you open it anyway because staying where you are has stopped being an option. She stood up to go back to her rounds. She was almost at the door when Dane said, "Ms. Marsh, is there anything else in that box that we haven't discussed?" She paused with her hand near the door handle. Outside in the hallway, she could hear voices, the shift change beginning, the ordinary transfer of one set of humans to another in the long relay race of keeping people alive. "Yes," she said. "What?" She looked back at him. "Photographs. From inside the rehabilitation facility. The dogs that were cleared." She kept her voice even. "And a personnel file that was never supposed to leave the base. It has the names of everyone who signed off on the program." She paused. "Including a name above Hollis." The silence in the room had a different quality now. "How far up?" Vought asked. Evelyn looked at her steadily. Far enough that you're going to want to call someone before we drive to Durango. She left them sitting with that and walked back to her ward, where the afternoon shift was taking over and no one knew what had just happened in the consultation room. And the monitors beeped in their steady rhythms, and somewhere 2.5 hours north, in a storage unit rented under an old name, a fireproof box sat waiting in the dark with enough inside it to bring down something much larger than one hospital in a mountain town in Colorado. She got back to the nursing station and picked up the next chart and started reading. Then her personal phone buzzed. Unknown number. Text message, 4 words. We know about Durango. 4 words on a screen, and her entire body made a decision before her mind finished reading them. She walked back to the consultation room without running, because running in a hospital hallway draws attention, and she needed exactly none of that right now. She pushed the door open without knocking. Vought looked up. Dane was mid-sentence with the CID officer and stopped. Evelyn held up her phone. Vought read it, passed it to Dane without speaking. The CID officer, whose name Evelyn still hadn't caught, leaned over and read it from Dane's hand, and her jaw tightened by a few degrees. When did you receive this? Vought asked. 40 seconds ago. Unknown number? Yes. Dane was already on his own phone, stepping toward the corner. Vought stood and moved to the window, not to look out of it, but to put a wall at her back, which Evelyn noted as an instinctive tactical repositioning that told her something about Vaught's background that her title hadn't. Is the box exactly where it was when you last accessed it? Vought asked. 3 weeks ago, yes. Did you tell anyone else about the storage unit any time in the last 8 years? One person, Evelyn said. The man I called when you first arrived. He knows about the unit, but not the specific contents. Name. Marcus Webb. He was my squad leader. He lives in Billings now. He's not part of this. Vought absorbed that. How would someone connect you to a storage unit in Durango? I don't know. That was the honest answer, and it was also the most unsettling one. She'd been careful. She'd been careful in the specific procedural way of someone who had understood from the beginning that being careful wasn't optional. Unless they've been monitoring me longer than the last 48 hours. The CID officer straightened. If they have surveillance on her, the unit is already compromised. Not necessarily, Evelyn said. They both looked at her. The unit is registered to a name I use legally for 14 months post-separation. If they're monitoring me as Evelyn Marsh, they'd need to connect that name to the previous one. That's a gap. She paused. But if they're connected enough to have someone inside this hospital and access to DoD personnel files, the gap may already be closed. Dane came back from the corner. I've got a team that can be at the storage facility in 90 minutes. They'll secure the contents before anyone else gets there. He looked at Evelyn. We need the unit number and the access code. She gave them to him from memory. He relayed them and then looked at her with an expression that was professionally neutral, but carried underneath it the particular quality of someone recalibrating what they understood about who they were dealing with. She'd seen that expression before, in other contexts. She'd learned not to take satisfaction in it. You need to stay in this building, Vought said. Don't go to your car. Don't go to your apartment. I'm still on shift. Good. Stay on it. Evelyn went back to the ward. The afternoon shift was in full swing, the hallway populated with the familiar faces of colleagues who had no idea that a federal investigation was currently occupying a consultation room 50 feet away. She picked up the next chart in her rotation and kept moving. Her hands were steady. That was the thing she noticed. They'd been shaking slightly 2 days ago when Atlas had pushed his nose against them, and now, with a 4-word threat sitting in her phone, and federal agents in a room down the hall and the contents of a fireproof box potentially already in someone else's hands, now they were steady. She didn't examine that too closely. Some things worked better when you left them alone. At 3:20, the fire alarm went off. Not a drill. The tone was different from the drill tone. She'd learned that distinction in her second week at Redstone because she'd asked the safety officer to explain it, and he'd seemed mildly surprised that anyone wanted to know. The drill tone cycled. The real alarm held. The protocol moved automatically, nurses beginning to account for patients, checking for smoke, the PA system activating with instructions that were designed to be calm and achieved something adjacent to it. Frank Cardullo's security team hit the stairwells. Evelyn stayed with her patients on the ward and did her job. The alarm ran for 11 minutes before it was silenced. No fire, no smoke. The report that circulated through the hallway afterward said it had originated from a supply closet on the third floor, a heat sensor activation with no identified cause. Evelyn thought about that supply closet, third floor, east wing, directly above the corridor where the consultation room sat. She thought about 11 minutes during which every available staff member and security officer in the building was focused on evacuation protocols, and the consultation room would have been temporarily unsupervised while Vaught and Dane managed the response. She went to find Russell Dade. He was at the station, still running post-alarm patient checks. She leaned close enough that no one passing could hear. The alarm. Who reported the sensor activation? He looked at her. Anonymous call to the facilities desk. Apparently someone said they smelled something. Who took the call? I don't know. Can you find out? He picked up the phone without asking why. She went to the consultation room. The door was ajar. Vaught was inside on the phone. Dane was not there. She stepped in and Vaught held up a finger without breaking her call. Not dismissively, but in the specific gesture of someone managing multiple streams. Evelyn looked at the table. The recording device was still there. The folio was closed. One of the chairs had been pushed back from the table at an angle that suggested someone had stood up fast. Dane, Vaught said, having ended her call. He went to check the alarm source. He's not back yet. How long? Vaught checked her watch. 7 minutes? 7 minutes to walk to the third floor and back was about 4 minutes too many for a building this size. Evelyn said, call him. Vaught was already doing it. 3 rings, 4, voicemail. She tried again, same result. The CID officer appeared in the doorway behind Evelyn. Her name, Evelyn had finally learned, was Major Dara Finch, and the expression she wore now was the same expression Evelyn had seen on people a long time ago when a situation had just shifted from concerning to something requiring a different kind of response. He's not picking up, Vaught said. Third floor, east wing supply corridor, Evelyn said to Finch. There's a stairwell at the end that opens to the parking structure. Finch was already moving. Vaught stayed. Her hand was at her side in a way that was deliberate and prepared, and told Evelyn that Vaught's civilian suit was not the whole of what she was. The alarm was a diversion, Evelyn said. Possibly. Not possibly. Vaught's expression tightened by a fraction. What's on that floor above us? Staff lockers, supply storage, biomedical equipment storage for things not in current rotation. Evelyn thought it through fast. And the IT server room for the East Wing. Hospital records, patient records, administrative systems, everything that runs through the East Wing network. She paused. Including whatever was accessed at 3:14 this morning to authorize Roy's transfer. If someone wanted to clean that log, Vaught moved past her into the hallway. Evelyn followed. The stairwell to the third floor was accessed through a door at the north end of the ward, and they took it fast without running, which was a specific skill Evelyn had not had to use in years and found immediately available when she needed it. The third floor hallway was quieter than the second. The staff up here were already returning to their positions after the alarm, mostly clerical and support, and the East Wing corridor was clear except for a facilities manager walking away from them with a clipboard. The supply closet where the alarm had originated was on their left, door closed. The IT server room was 30 feet further, a reinforced door with a keypad entry. The door was ajar. Vaught put her hand out, stop, and moved ahead. Evelyn stopped. She was not armed, and she was not law enforcement, and she stayed where she was and watched the hallway and listened. 12 seconds. Vaught appeared in the server room doorway and said one word over her shoulder. Clear. Evelyn walked to the doorway and looked in. The room was the size of a large closet, ranked with server towers and the particular thick tangle of cable that no IT department ever quite managed to make tidy. One of the access panels on the near rack was open. A small device, plastic, maybe 2 inches long, was attached to one of the cable ports. It hadn't been there long. Evelyn could see the edge of fresh adhesive. Don't touch it, Vaught said, though Evelyn hadn't moved toward it. She was on her radio. The device was designed to pull data. That was the obvious interpretation. But data exfiltration on hospital systems was generally measured in time, You needed minutes to extract anything meaningful, longer for structured database content. And the alarm had been triggered 11 minutes ago, which meant whoever had placed this had been working fast and probably hadn't gotten everything they were after before the alarm window closed and staff movement resumed. Which meant they'd left in a hurry. Which meant they might not have gotten the server log. Vought was communicating all of this to someone through the radio while Evelyn stood in the doorway and thought about what a person in a hurry would prioritize. If the goal was to erase the 314 access record, the most efficient approach was to pull the authentication log directly rather than wipe the system wholesale, which would trigger its own alerts. A targeted extraction. 2 to 3 minutes if you knew the architecture. The alarm had given them 11. Who has access to this room? Vought asked. IT staff, biomedical, facilities for maintenance. Evelyn paused. Senior administration. Candace Briggs. She'd have a key. Her credentials cover most of the building. Vought spoke into the radio again. Then she looked at Evelyn with the steady, appraising focus that had been there since the beginning, but had a different quality now. Not skepticism, but reliance. The shift that happens when someone has been proven right enough times that you start orienting toward them instead of running parallel. We need to pull the keycard log for this room for the last 2 hours. Russell can get that. Get him. Evelyn went back down the stairwell. She found Russell at the nursing station, still on the phone tracing the facility's desk call. She gave him the new request in 2 sentences and watched him shift without complaint from one task to the other, because Russell Dade had worked in emergency medicine long enough to understand that sometimes the situation updates faster than the plan. Dane reappeared at 3:58, walking into the ward from the main elevator with a controlled expression and a darkening mark along his left jaw that hadn't been there before. Evelyn saw it from the nursing station. He saw her see it and moved directly toward her. Someone was in the east stairwell, he said quietly. Male, 180. Civilian clothes. He came from above me. I went down. He didn't elaborate on what had happened in the stairwell, but the mark on his jaw and the slight favoring of his right side as he walked described it adequately. He got to the parking structure. Did you see the vehicle? Gray. Possibly a van. He paused. Possibly the same plates from the Callahan transport. The same vehicle. Not 2 separate operations, the same network, the same resources, operating against the same investigation from both ends. Remove the witness, compromise the evidence, access the records. 3 simultaneous angles of attack, staged across 2 days. That level of coordination didn't come from improvisation, it came from preparation. Someone had known the investigators were coming before they arrived, or had been watching for exactly this scenario long enough to have a contingency ready. She told Dane about the device in the server room. His expression went flat in the specific way of someone absorbing bad news and immediately converting it to operational response. They went back upstairs together. The next hour was something she observed from the inside of a controlled professional response that felt from the outside like the hospital was simply having a busy afternoon. Finch's team swept the East Wing. A technician from Dane's office arrived with equipment she didn't recognize and spent 30 minutes in the server room. 2 additional federal vehicles arrived in the parking structure and were visible from the 3rd-floor window, dark SUVs, the kind that carried no particular markings and required no announcement. Hollis appeared at 4:15, approaching the 3rd-floor corridor with the administrative posture of a man asserting his authority over his building. Finch intercepted him before he reached the server room door. Evelyn couldn't hear the exchange, but she watched Hollis's face from 30 feet and saw the moment the conversation changed character. The moment he understood that the woman in the military uniform was not having a discussion with him, but informing him of something. His color went slightly off. He looked past Finch and found Evelyn in the hallway. She looked back at him without expression. He looked away first. At 4:43, Dane's phone rang. He took it in the corridor and came back with an expression that had changed in a specific way. The team reached Durango, he said to Vought. The storage unit was intact. Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't been aware of holding. They're transporting the contents under escort. We'll have it tonight. He looked at Evelyn. The unit hadn't been accessed. The lock was original. The text was a bluff, Vought said. Or they knew the location and hadn't moved on it yet. Dane's tone suggested he thought the second option was more likely. Either way, the contents are secure. Evelyn sat down in the hallway chair outside the server room, the kind of hard plastic chair that exists in every institutional corridor in the world, and for the first time in 2 days, let herself feel the particular exhaustion of sustained high-function alertness. It was not pleasant. It sat behind her eyes and in the muscles of her upper back, and it felt exactly like what it was, the cost of carrying something for a long time. She gave herself approximately 90 seconds of that. Then she stood up and asked Dane what came next. What came next, it turned out, was Candace Briggs. Russell had pulled the keycard log and found what Evelyn had expected to find. Candace's credentials used to access the IT server room at 3:47 that afternoon. Candace had clocked in for her weekend shift at 7 that morning. She was in the building. Finch and one of her team members found Candace in the administrative office suite on the first floor. The conversation that followed was not observed directly by Evelyn, but the broad shape of it traveled through the building in the way that significant events do in institutions. Not through announcement, but through the behavior of the people who witnessed adjacent pieces of it. The administrative assistant who shared the suite told Petra, who told Russell, who told Evelyn. Candace had cried. She had asked for a lawyer within the first 3 minutes. She had said, twice, that she hadn't understood what she was part of. That last part, Evelyn believed, actually. Not because Candace was a good person in any particular moral accounting, but because the operation she'd been slotted into was not designed to give its peripheral participants a clear view of the whole. You use someone's credentials without their knowledge for the 314 transfer, and then you leverage that. We have evidence placing you in the system. Help us now or face what comes after. And suddenly, a woman who had been looking at a staff profile out of mild institutional loyalty was standing in an administrator's office telling federal agents she hadn't understood what she was part of. She probably hadn't. That was the design. By 6 o'clock, the building had a different character. Evelyn couldn't have described it precisely to someone who hadn't felt it. The way a space changes when the people inside it begin to understand that something significant has been happening within its walls, not outside them. Staff who passed each other in the hallways moved a little differently, spoke a little more quietly, with the awareness of people who are beginning to revise their understanding of where they are. She finished her shift at 6:30. Vaught came to the ward to tell her that a protective team would accompany her to her apartment, that her car should stay in the hospital lot, and that they needed her available the following morning for a formal recorded interview. "The box gets here tonight?" Evelyn asked. "Estimated 9 o'clock. Then I'll be available." She collected her bag from her locker and walked toward the elevator, and she was passing the north end of the second-floor corridor when she heard Atlas before she saw him. Not a bark. The dog didn't bark in hospitals. A short, low sound, a single note of alert that she recognized from the brief time she'd spent in proximity to working dogs and their particular vocabulary. She turned. Dennis Farrow was standing at the end of the corridor with Atlas on lead, and the dog was not looking at Dennis. He was looking past him, toward the supply corridor that ran behind the East Nursing Station, a service passage used mainly by housekeeping, not generally trafficked by visitors or staff at shift change. Atlas was still. Very still. The kind of stillness that in a trained animal does not mean calm. Dennis looked at Evelyn. "He's been doing that for 4 minutes. I brought him back to get Roy's personal items from the room, and he started, Don't go in there," she said. She moved toward the nursing station and found Russell. "Who's in the service corridor right now?" He checked the board. Housekeeping finished that section at 5. Nobody scheduled. "Call Cardolo." She walked back toward Dennis. Atlas had not moved. The low alert sound came again, not directed at them, directed at the door to the service corridor. From behind the door, she heard nothing. That was the thing. In a hospital at 6:30 on a Saturday evening, even the service corridors had sound. Carts, distant voices, the hum of laundry systems. Behind that door there was a specific, deliberate quiet, the kind that a person makes when they're waiting. Cardullo arrived 90 seconds later with 2 security officers. He assessed Atlas's posture without needing Evelyn to explain it, and spoke into his radio with the clipped efficiency of a man who had worked law enforcement long enough to trust a trained dog's stillness over his own uncertainty. Major Finch came from the stairwell 30 seconds after that. They moved to the door. What happened next took less than 4 minutes and was, in the aftermath, described by the security officer closest to the door as controlled, which was the word people used when they meant the alternative had been narrowly avoided. The man in the service corridor was found at the far end near the laundry access hatch, carrying a tablet device and a second extraction unit identical to the one pulled from the server room. He identified himself as Facilities Maintenance. His ID badge was a very good forgery, the kind that passed a visual check and failed a scanner, and nobody had scanned it because he'd entered during the fire alarm window when the east entrance scanner had been disabled for evacuation compliance. Finch's team took him. Atlas, in the 30 seconds before the door was opened and the hallway became loud with radio calls and movement, had turned and walked calmly back to where Evelyn was standing and placed his head against her hip. The same posture as the first day, the same contact without the urgency. She put her hand on the back of his neck. Dennis watched this from 6 feet away with an expression that had passed through several stages and arrived at something quiet and complicated. "He keeps doing that," he said. "I know. I've never seen him, not with anyone except Roy and the 2 handlers before Roy." She didn't respond to that. She stood with the dog's weight against her and listened to the hallway resolve itself around the aftermath of something that had almost happened and hadn't. And she was aware that her hands were not shaking, and she was not sure if that was strength or something that had been pressed so flat by years of controlled response that it could no longer locate the surface. The man from the corridor was taken to a secure location within the building pending transfer to federal custody. Finch informed Vaught within minutes, and the communication that followed, a series of calls that Evelyn was not part of but could read in the posture and movement of everyone around her, had the quality of a situation escalating up a chain of command faster than the chain had expected. Dane came to find her at 7:15. He looked like someone who had not been expecting this particular Saturday and was recalibrating his timeline for everything that came after it. "The man in the corridor," he said. "He's not talking, but we've ID'd him." He paused. "He's former military, contractor employment starting 2018. His last listed employer is a subsidiary company that doesn't appear to have any independent operations." He paused. "It bills through Meridian K9 Solutions." Evelyn absorbed that. "They sent someone into the hospital," she said. "They sent someone in before the investigators arrived," Dane said. "We think he's been here since Thursday, possibly longer." He let that sit for a moment. "Which means they knew we were coming before we arrived." Inside the investigation itself, a leak inside the investigation. That was the implication, and she could see from his face that he was aware of it and was not comfortable with what it meant. "The box gets here at 9, he said. "When it does, we're moving to a secured federal location for the review, not here." He looked at her steadily. "You're coming with it." "I know," she said. "Bring whatever you need for a few days." She thought about her apartment, the folded flag in the shadow box, the good kitchen knives that she would not be bringing, the clarity of a space that contained almost nothing unnecessary. "I don't need much," she said. She went to get her bag. The hospital was moving into its evening rhythm now, the day shift largely gone, the overnight staff establishing themselves in the particular quiet that hospitals find after 6 when the administrative machinery slows and the clinical reality of the night reasserts itself. She passed through it the way she always did, part of it, visible inside it, the form that moved through its corridors 6 days a week without drawing attention. Except that tonight, as she walked through the second-floor hallway toward the exit that Vaught's team had designated, she noticed something different. The nurses at the station watched her pass. Not the way people watch someone they're dismissing, the way they watch something they're trying to understand, the person they thought they knew, revised. Petra, who had been doing crosswords and avoiding eye contact since the investigators arrived, met her gaze directly for the first time in 2 days and gave a small, uncertain nod. Evelyn nodded back and kept walking. In the lobby, the box from Durango was arriving. She knew because Dane was moving toward the main entrance with 2 other people from his team, and through the glass doors she could see a vehicle she didn't recognize, engine running, with two people she also didn't recognize standing beside it with the alert posture of an escort detail. The box was still in the vehicle. She could see the case through the glass, gray, fireproof, exactly as she'd left it 3 weeks ago, and the 8 years of careful preservation that it represented felt suddenly very real and very close, the way that things you've lived with abstractly sometimes become concrete and present without warning. She was 20 feet from the door when her phone rang, not the unknown number, a number she knew. Marcus Webb, in Billings, calling for the second time since this began. She answered. Marsh. His voice was different from the last call. Not alarmed, Marcus didn't do alarmed, but stripped of the usual buffer between what he was thinking and what he was saying. I need to tell you something I should have told you when you called 2 days ago. Tell me now. A pause, long enough to tell her it was something he'd been deciding whether to say. When you filed the complaint in 2017, there was a second investigation, not the one you knew about, DODIG, but a different team, a counterintelligence unit running parallel to the standard process. They were looking at Meridian, but they were also looking at who inside the Army had flagged the problem. Another pause. They were looking at you, Marsh. They thought you might have been placed inside the MWD program specifically to surface the corruption, opposition research, testing the system. She stopped walking. Who tasked that unit? I didn't know at the time. I found out after you separated. He paused again. It was a deputy director in Army acquisitions. Name of Brower. Philip Brower. The lobby was quiet around her. The box was coming through the main doors now, carried by 2 of Dane's team, and Dane was watching her from across the space with the particular attention of someone who has noticed that you've stopped moving. Philip Brower. She turned the name over, ran it against everything she knew, every name in the documents, every signature on the clearance reports. She had never seen that name, but she had seen the name directly above it in the acquisition chain. Once. In an email chain that had been printed and placed in a fireproof box in Durango, Colorado, and had just come through those doors. Marcus, she said, what is Brower's current position? The pause this time was the kind that meant he already knew why she was asking. He was promoted, Marcus said. He's not in acquisitions anymore. A breath. He's been Deputy Secretary of Defense since January. The lobby of Redstone Memorial Hospital was exactly as it had always been. The main desk, the chairs, the photographs of the mountains on the walls, the ordinary institutional fluorescence of a place designed to receive people at the worst moments of their lives. Nothing about it had changed in the last 5 seconds. Everything else had. She looked at Dane across the lobby and saw from his face that he did not yet know what she had just learned, and she understood with absolute clarity that the moment she walked to him and said the name Philip Brower, the investigation, already federal, already involving CID and the DODIG, was going to become something different in scale and character and danger. She also understood that she was going to walk to him and say it anyway. But before she took the first step, the main doors behind the escort team opened again, and a third vehicle pulled up outside. This one she didn't recognize, and the people who got out of it were not Dane's team and not Finch's team and the lead figure, a man in his 50s, silver hair, military bearing and civilian clothes, looked through the glass directly at her. She did not recognize his face, but he walked like someone who had never once in his life doubted that the room he was entering already belonged to him. She ended the call and put the phone in her pocket and crossed the lobby toward Dane. She didn't look at the man coming through the doors. She looked at Dane because Dane was her point of contact and the next 30 seconds needed to happen in the right order. She reached him before the silver-haired man reached the desk, and she put herself at an angle that kept the doors in her peripheral vision while she spoke quietly and directly. Philip Brower, she said, Deputy Secretary of Defense. His name is in the documents. He ran a counterintelligence unit in 2017 that was used to surveil me after I filed the complaint. He's the layer above everyone else we've named. Dane's face did something careful and controlled. How do you know that name? My former squad leader. He's been sitting on it. She paused. I don't think he knew how high it went until recently. Dane looked past her at the man who had just cleared the main doors. His expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened in the way she'd learned to read over the past 2 days. A specific, focused stillness that meant he was processing something fast. Do you know who that is? She asked. Yes, Dane said quietly. He looked back at her. That's Richard Alton. He's Brower's chief of staff. The lobby had the quality now of a room where several things were happening simultaneously, and none of them were visible on the surface. Cardullo's security team near the desk, Finch by the corridor entrance, the escort team with the gray case standing in the middle of the space like a still point around which everything else was moving, and Alton crossing the lobby with the unhurried authority of someone who expected the room to organize itself around his arrival. He stopped 6 feet from Dane. He did not look at Evelyn. "Agent Dane," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where people listened when he spoke, and had stopped noticing it. "I've been sent to inform you that this investigation is being reviewed at the departmental level. Pending that review, the transfer of any materials from this location requires authorization from the Office of the Deputy Secretary." "This investigation operates under DODIG authority," Dane said, "independent of departmental oversight." "That independence is exactly what's under review." Alton's tone was not hostile. It was something more effective than hostile. It was final, the tone of someone presenting a decision rather than arguing for one. "I'd recommend you speak with your director before making any transfers tonight." "I intend to speak with my director," Dane said, "but the materials currently in this building are evidence in a federal investigation, and their custody isn't subject to departmental authorization." A pause. Alton's gaze moved briefly to the gray case, then to Evelyn, for the first time. A single assessing look that lasted less than 2 seconds and communicated, in those 2 seconds, that he knew exactly who she was and had known before he walked through those doors. "You're Marsh," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her the way powerful people sometimes look at inconvenient things, not with contempt exactly, but with a kind of institutional impatience, as if her continued relevance was a logistical problem that should have been resolved by now. Then he looked back at Dane. "I'd suggest," Alton said, "that you think carefully about the position you're placing yourself in." Dane said nothing. That was the right call. There was nothing to say to that which wouldn't either concede ground or escalate in a direction that required more authority than he currently had in this lobby. Alton nodded once, as if something had been agreed, and moved toward the administrative desk. Dane turned to Evelyn. "Go with the case. Now." Back entrance, the vehicle is still running. He spoke quietly and without urgency, which was how she knew the urgency was real. "I need to make calls. Major Finch will go with you." "What about Alton?" "I'll manage Alton." He met her eyes briefly. "Go." She went. Finch materialized beside her without being summoned. She'd been watching, clearly, and the 2 members of the escort team picked up the case and followed. They moved through the corridor toward the back of the building, away from the lobby, away from Alton's presence and the administrative weight it carried. Evelyn knew the route without being shown it. 6 years in this building meant she could navigate it in the dark if she had to, which she had briefly considered a morbid and irrelevant piece of self-knowledge and now reconsidered. The vehicle was a dark SUV, engine running as Dane had said, a driver inside who acknowledged Finch with a nod and did not speak. They loaded the case in the back. Finch sat in the rear with it. Evelyn got in the passenger side because Finch positioned herself beside the case without discussing it, and that arrangement made operational sense. They pulled out of the hospital parking lot at 7:41. Nobody spoke for the first 4 minutes. The town of Ashford ran past the windows, the gas station, the grocery store, the dark outline of the Rockies beginning to assert themselves against the evening sky. Normal Saturday, people going home. "Brower," Finch said from the back seat. Evelyn turned slightly. "You heard." "I was 6 feet away." Finch had a way of sitting that was completely still, not rigid, just settled, the posture of someone whose body had learned to conserve itself. "Brower has been on a separate list." A name that kept coming up at the perimeter of 3 different investigations over the last 6 years, never close enough to the center to action. "He designed it that way," Evelyn said. "The counterintelligence unit he tasked in 2017. That wasn't his only use of institutional infrastructure for personal protection. The Meridian contract ran through an acquisitions approval chain where he had oversight. He didn't sign anything directly. He shaped the environment in which the signatures happened." Finch was quiet for a moment. "That's in the box?" The email chain shows the acquisition's pathway. It doesn't name Brower directly. It names his deputy at the time, a woman named Sandra Kaur, but Kaur's approval authority ran through his office. Evelyn paused. I have a separate document. A memo from the MWD program director in 2017 referencing a phone conversation with a senior acquisitions official who expressed concern that the rehabilitation program was being reviewed. The memo doesn't name the official, but the date of the call, cross-referenced with the counterintelligence unit activation date, is 12 days. Finch processed that. Circumstantial. On its own. Combined with the email chain, Kaur's testimony if she can be turned, and the pattern of the counterintelligence unit's activity, it builds, Finch said. It builds, Evelyn agreed. The driver took the on-ramp for the federal building in Millhaven, 22 miles east. The mountains fell behind them, and the highway opened up, flat and lit by the kind of half-dark that Colorado managed in summer, the sky not quite finished with light. Evelyn sat with the movement of the vehicle and let herself think about Hollis. Hollis had been the piece she'd known about the longest. The civilian consulting arrangement, the 18 months of clearance opinions, the role in closing her complaint. But knowing about Hollis and being able to do something about Hollis were different things. And for most of the past 6 years, the gap between them had been measured in institutional weight. He had credentials. He had 22 years. He had the particular authority that comes from being the person who never gets questioned in their own building. She thought about the look on his face in the consultation room doorway. Not just recognition, but something adjacent to fear. Not of her, but of the shape of the situation she was standing inside. She wondered if he understood yet how complete that shape was. The federal building in Millhaven was not large, a 4-story structure that handled various agency operations in the region and had a basement level secured for exactly this kind of material transfer. They arrived at 8:12. The case was signed in, logged, and placed in a temperature-controlled evidence room with a 2-person verification process that Evelyn observed from the doorway and found thorough enough to satisfy. Then they put her in a conference room and asked her to start from the beginning. Not Vaught, who arrived 40 minutes later looking like someone who had spent the intervening time on consecutive phone calls. Not Dane, who was still at the hospital managing Alton. The person who sat across from her for the next 3 hours was a woman named Agent Claire Sorensen, from a DODIG division Evelyn hadn't heard of, who had a recorder and a legal pad, and the specific quality of attention that meant she was not just listening to what was being said, but building a structure from it in real time. Evelyn started in 2016 and didn't leave anything out. It was the first time she had told all of it in sequence to someone who was writing it down with the authority to do something with it. She had rehearsed versions of this in her head over the years, not obsessively, but the way you rehearse anything that matters, in the quiet moments before sleep or during the long middle of a night shift when the ward was stable and her mind had room to move. She thought she would feel more when it finally happened. Instead, she felt like someone completing a task that had been on a list for a very long time, the particular flat satisfaction of a thing done rather than the relief she'd imagined. Sorensen asked precise questions and took precise notes. At 11:15, she stepped out of the room for 20 minutes. When she came back, something had changed in her posture, not dramatically, but in the small ways that significant information changes the way a person carries themselves. The email chain, Sorensen said, the core correspondence. We've been looking for that for 4 years. It was printed before the server was decommissioned, Evelyn said, August 2017. We know. We knew a hard copy likely existed. We couldn't find it. She looked at Evelyn directly. You held this for 8 years. I needed the rest of the picture first. Sorensen studied her for a moment. And do you have it now? Alton showing up tonight, Evelyn said. That's the picture. After Sorensen left the room again, Evelyn sat alone with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in the accumulated weight of the evening, and she let herself be tired in the way she hadn't allowed during any of the hours before this one. Her back ached from the plastic chair. Her eyes were dry. She thought about Atlas in that hospital corridor, the way he'd placed himself between Dennis and the service corridor door without being commanded, and she thought about Roy Callahan lying in a bed in Pueblo, waiting for his blood to stabilize. And she thought about the folded flag in her apartment that she might not get back to for several days. She thought about Hollis walking into his building on Monday morning, not knowing that the ground he was walking on had already changed beneath him. At 12:40, Dane arrived. He looked like someone who had won an argument that had cost him more than expected. He sat down across from her without preamble. Alton left the hospital at 9:15. The materials authorization claim has been referred to the DODIG Director's Office, which has formal independence from the Deputy Secretary's office. He paused. That's the correct channel, and it's going to bury his request for approximately as long as we need. What about Brower? We briefed the IG director 40 minutes ago. A beat. With the core connection and the counterintelligence unit documentation, we have enough for a formal investigation at the Deputy Secretary level. That's been authorized tonight. She absorbed that. A formal investigation at that level didn't move quietly or quickly. It moved through channels that had their own gravitational weight, but it moved with a finality that the smaller pieces of this hadn't had. Hollis, she said, his consulting arrangement with Meridian is documented in your materials and corroborated by 2 additional sources we've developed independently over the past 18 months. We'll move on him in the morning. He looked at her steadily. That's going to happen in his building, at Redstone. She nodded once. There's one more thing, Dane said. He put a photograph on the table. The man from the service corridor. He's talking. He asked for a deal 2 hours ago. He paused. He says he was hired through an intermediary, but he knows the intermediary, and the intermediary is someone who has been at Redstone Memorial for 4 years. She looked at the photograph, then at Dane. Who? She said. He told her. She sat with it for a moment. The name was not a surprise in the way of something shocking. It was a surprise in the way of something that clicked into place, the final piece of a shape you'd been building in the dark and could now see completely. The person he named had been at the periphery of every significant moment in the last 4 days, not visibly, not in any way that would have drawn attention, but present. At the edges. In the administrative systems. In the channels through which information moved inside the hospital. Not Hollis, not Candace, someone who moved more quietly than either of them and had been doing so for 4 years. Does he know you have this? She asked. No. Then we have until morning, she said. She slept 3 hours on a cot in a room adjacent to the evidence storage, and woke at 5:50 with the particular disorientation of a person in an unfamiliar space who resolves it very quickly because they've done it many times before. She washed her face, drank water, and reviewed the documentation summary that Sorensen had left outside the room, a 3-page index of the box's contents cross-referenced against the investigation's existing file, with highlights in yellow marker where the new material corroborated or extended existing evidence. There were a lot of yellow marks. The drive back to Ashford at 7:15 was gray and cold, the mountains reappearing through low cloud, the kind of Colorado morning that felt like the landscape was deciding whether to be beautiful or inhospitable and hadn't made up its mind. Finch drove. Dane sat in the back on his phone for most of the journey. They arrived at Redstone Memorial at 7:58. The morning shift was underway. The parking lot held the usual spread of vehicles, the usual movement of staff between the structure and the main entrance. Nothing visible had changed, but Evelyn knew what was about to happen in this building, and she walked through its main doors understanding that the version of this place she'd occupied for the past 6 years, the one where she was the nurse who'd been quietly moved to the observation ward, whose flags were ignored, whose judgment was questioned by men who had not earned the right to question it, was in the process of being revised. Hollis arrived at 8:20. She knew because Russell texted her from the ward. She was in the second-floor corridor when it happened, not watching but aware, and she heard it rather than saw it. Voices from the administrative hallway on the ground floor, a door, the particular register of a conversation that was not going the way one of its participants had expected. Finch's team took 40 minutes. Evelyn spent those 40 minutes on the ward doing her job, because there were patients whose checks needed to happen, and the fact that the chief of emergency medicine was being formally interviewed on the ground floor about his role in a federal fraud investigation did not change the medication schedule or the vitals monitoring or the needs of the people in the rooms down the hall. She understood this might look to some people like performance, like she was demonstrating something by continuing to work through it. It wasn't performance. It was simply what came next. And she had always done what came next. At 9:03, she was checking a drip line when Russell appeared in the doorway. His face had the particular expression of someone delivering news that they have had to process themselves before they could carry it to someone else. "They took him out through the main entrance," he said. She looked up. "Not the administrative exit, the main entrance." He paused. "I think it was deliberate." It was deliberate. She understood that without having to be told who had made that decision, Finch, probably, or Dane, and she understood the reason for it. Not spectacle for its own sake, but a specific, calibrated visibility. A building where the chief of emergency medicine had operated for 17 years needed to see the moment the protected status of that position ended. Not for punishment, for clarity, for the institutional record of what had happened here and what was no longer acceptable. "Who else?" she asked. Russell hesitated. "They're in administration now. I don't have names yet." She nodded and went back to the drip line. By 10 o'clock, the shape of the morning had become clear to most of the staff at Redstone Memorial in the way that these things become clear in institutions, not through announcement, but through accumulation. 2 administrators had been escorted from the building. The formal interview process was ongoing in the ground floor conference rooms. The hospital's legal counsel had arrived at 9:40 and been immediately occupied. The board chair, a woman named Margaret Voss, who'd been reached by phone at her home outside Ashford, was on her way in. Petra found Evelyn in the corridor at 10:30. She stood for a moment as if she'd been rehearsing what to say and had arrived at the conclusion that none of it was adequate. "I saw them move your assignment," she said finally, "when Hollis filed the paperwork. I knew it wasn't right, and I didn't say anything." Evelyn looked at her. Petra was 29, 3 years into her nursing career, not a bad person, a person who had learned very quickly what the cost of saying the wrong thing in the wrong room could be, and had made the calculation that most people make. "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm sorry." "I know that too." She meant it without softness or sharpness, just the flat acknowledgement of something true. "Keep being better at it." Petra nodded and walked away, and Evelyn thought that was probably the most honest exchange she'd had with a colleague in 6 years. At 11:15, Dane came to the ward. He looked like someone who had now been awake for approximately 36 hours and had made peace with that some hours ago. He sat in the chair across from her at the nursing station and put a folder on the desk and let her look at it without saying anything first. The first page was a formal evidence summary. 39 falsified veterinary clearances, confirmed. 17 dogs with documented injuries that had been cleared regardless. The contractor's operational structure laid out in the clean, hierarchical language of a federal indictment document. The second page was a list of names. She read it carefully. Some she knew. Some she recognized from the documents she'd preserved. Some were new to her, people who'd been identified through the investigation's independent work, connecting to the Meridian network through subsidiary companies and consulting arrangements and the various instruments of institutional insulation that people with resources use when they are doing things they understand to be indefensible. Hollis was on it. His consulting arrangement itemized. Sandra Kaur was on it. Her approval chain documented. 3 senior military officers she'd never heard of were on it, their roles described in 2 sentences each. The bureaucratic precision of the language somehow more damning than any dramatic phrasing could have been. She turned to the third page and stopped. Brower was not on it. She looked up. Dane was watching her. "His investigation is separate," he said. "Different team, different jurisdiction at that level. It's moving." He paused carefully. "It's moving, Marsh." Slowly and correctly. "Those 2 things are the same thing at that level." She turned back to the list. Read it through again. The CEO of Meridian K9 Solutions, a man named Warren Holt, 61, whose company had billed the Army $47 million over 5 years, had been arrested at his home in Phoenix at 6 that morning. The arrest had not been quiet. His legal team had been contacted simultaneously in a way that was designed to prevent any communication that might alert others before the other arrests were made. The others had been made. 12 people in total across 3 states picked up in a coordinated window between 5:45 and 7:30 that morning while Evelyn was sleeping on a cot 3 hours away. She closed the folder. "Atlas," she said. Dane's expression shifted slightly. He reached into the folder and pulled one more page. A veterinary assessment, recent, with imaging attached. Roy Callahan authorized a full diagnostic workup last night. The Pueblo vet coordinated with a military working dog specialist in Colorado Springs. He set the page in front of her. He has a progressive joint condition in his left shoulder and hip. The meridian clearance cleared him as fit with minor wear notation. The specialist's assessment is that the condition has been present and detectable for at least 3 years. She looked at the imaging. The damage was visible even to a non-specialist, the kind of structural change that should have ended a dog's working career 2 years before it did. "Can it be treated?" she said. "Surgery and managed rehabilitation. The specialist says with proper intervention, his quality of life can be significantly improved." Dane paused. "Roy has already approved it. It's scheduled for Thursday." She sat with that for a moment. She was still sitting with it when her phone buzzed. Personal cell, unknown number, different from the number that had sent the forward text. She answered. Silence on the other end. Then a voice she didn't recognize, male, careful, and controlled. "This is a courtesy call, Miss Marsh. You've been thorough, more thorough than most." A pause. "But you should know that the document you're most proud of, the core correspondence, has a problem." She was very still. "Who is this?" "Someone who has read those emails more carefully than your investigators have." Another pause, deliberate. Page 6. Third email. The date stamp on that email is from a server timestamp, not a sender timestamp. The server was in a different time zone than the sender. Your investigators are going to find, when they authenticate that document, that the apparent 12-day window between the acquisitions approval and the counterintelligence activation doesn't exist in a legally admissible form. A beat. Without that window, you have circumstance, not connection. The call ended. She held the phone and looked at the folder on the desk and thought about the email chain she had memorized 8 years ago, the dates she could recite without looking, the 12-day window she had built the Brower connection on. She pulled the folder open and found the evidence index Sorensen had left. Cross-referenced the third email on page 6. Found the authentication note in the margin, a small notation she'd read quickly this morning and moved past. Server timestamp, TZ verification pending. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she thought about why someone would call her with that information. Not to help her, to warn her, to let her know the link was fragile before the authentication came back, which meant either the caller was bluffing to rattle her confidence in the case, or the caller knew the authentication was going to fail and wanted her to know that Brower was still protected. Either way, someone with access to the evidence index had made a call to her personal cell number, someone inside the building she was currently sitting in. She stood up, went to the door of the ward, and looked down the hall toward the stairwell where Finch's team had been operating all morning. She counted the people she could see. Eliminated the one she could account for. One person was missing. She went back to the desk and picked up the folder and walked toward the stairwell, and as she pushed through the door, she heard from somewhere below her the sound of a door closing in the way that doors close when someone is trying not to be heard. She went down the stairwell quietly. Not chasing, she wasn't armed, wasn't law enforcement, and running at a sound in a stairwell was not a decision a person made with their body and left their brain out of. She went down deliberately, one hand trailing the rail, listening for the specific quality of silence that follows movement. Second floor landing. Nothing. First floor. The door to the administrative corridor was settling on its hinges, the micro-vibration of a door that had been opened and released within the last 15 seconds. She pushed through it. The administrative corridor ran east-west along the ground floor, connecting the main lobby to the records and billing offices. At this hour it was mostly cleared, Finch's interviews having wrapped in the conference rooms to the left. To the right, toward the east exit, she could see a figure moving with the controlled pace of someone trying to look purposeful rather than urgent. She recognized the posture before she recognized the face. Victor Lane, hospital IT director, 4 years at Redstone. The person whose department managed every system that had been accessed, every credential that had been borrowed, every server log that someone had tried to clean. The person whose expertise made him simultaneously the most capable of covering tracks and the most capable of knowing exactly which tracks to cover. She had worked beside him in the incidental way of hospital colleagues who share a building and a badge-in system and very little else. She had eaten lunch in the same break room. She had submitted IT tickets through his department for equipment issues. She had never had a reason to look at him carefully. She was looking at him now. "Victor," she said. He stopped. The pause before he turned was a fraction too long. Not dramatic, just the micro-hesitation of someone deciding which version of themselves to present. When he turned, his face was arranged in the expression of mild surprise that people use when they want to establish that an encounter is coincidental. "Evelyn," he held the expression. "Hell of a morning." "You have my personal cell number," she said. The expression didn't collapse. It recalibrated, a small tightening around the eyes, a slight shift in how he was distributing his weight. "Everyone in IT has emergency contact numbers for senior clinical staff. It's, you called me from a number that isn't in the hospital system," she said. "And you told me something about my evidence that only someone with access to the authentication notes would know." The corridor was empty except for them. Somewhere behind her, the elevator hummed. Somewhere ahead of him, the east exit waited, 30 feet away. He looked at her for a long moment. The performance of mild surprise had fully vacated his face, leaving something more honest and less pleasant. The expression of a man who has been running a calculation and has just reached the end of it. "You should walk away from this," he said. "The Brower connection is gone. Without it, you have mid-level arrests and a contractor shutdown. That's enough. That's more than most people get." "You made a call to warn me off," she said. "That means you're still trying to manage this, which means there's still something left to protect." "There's always something left to protect," he said, and the way he said it had a weariness in it that was almost honest, the tone of someone who had been in service to a structure for long enough that protecting it had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a condition of existing. "Whose asset are you?" she said. He didn't answer that. He turned and walked toward the east exit. She pulled out her phone and called Finch. Finch picked up on the first ring, and Evelyn gave her 20 words. "Victor Lane, east exit ground floor, IT director, made contact, moving now." Then she stood in the corridor and waited because there was nothing else to do, and she had learned a very long time ago that the moment of waiting, when the thing you've set in motion is out of your hands, is not a failure of nerve, but a form of discipline. Finch's team was faster than she expected. She heard the east exit door and then voices, 2, briefly, and then nothing. 40 seconds, start to finish. She walked to the east exit and found Lane standing against the exterior wall with his hands visible and a federal agent on each side of him, and the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision to stop moving. Finch stood 3 feet away with her arms crossed, and an expression that was professionally neutral in the way of someone who has seen this specific moment many times and feels nothing particular about it. "He made contact with the subject," Evelyn said. "Approximately 18 minutes ago. Unknown number to her personal cell. He disclosed details of authentication analysis from the evidence index." Finch looked at Lane. "That index was distributed to 6 people inside this building this morning." Lane said nothing. "It was a test," Evelyn said, understanding it as she said it. "The authentication note, TZ verification pending. That was a flag." Finch held her gaze for a moment. "It was a flag," she confirmed. "We needed to know who in our chain had a secondary contact." She looked at Lane. "Now we know." They took him inside. Evelyn stood at the east exit in the morning air for a moment, the cold coming down off the mountains the way it did in September in Colorado. The kind of cold that reminded you the season had already made a decision and wasn't asking. She breathed it in once, then went back through the doors. The next 4 hours were the long, procedural, unglamorous work of a situation resolving itself. Federal agents conducted interviews. Legal counsel for the hospital occupied the conference room for most of the morning and then moved into closed-door sessions with the board chair, Margaret Voss, who had arrived at 9 and had the expression of a woman who had accepted an important position in good faith and was now conducting a thorough accounting of what that faith had been placed in. Evelyn did her rounds. She checked lines and documented readings and answered the questions her patients asked her without letting any of what was happening in the rooms below show on her face. At 2 in the afternoon, Sorensen found her in the break room. "The timestamp issue," Sorensen said. She sat down without being invited, which Evelyn had come to understand was simply how Sorensen operated. "We ran the full authentication. You're right that the server timestamp creates a technical complication. It does not eliminate the connection." "Explain." "The email chain establishes communication. The TZ discrepancy affects the precise dating of one message by a margin of approximately 11 hours. The 12-day window becomes a 13-day window." She put a page on the table. "The counterintelligence unit was activated on day 13. The connection holds." Evelyn looked at the page. Lane didn't know that. No. He knew there was a timestamp issue. He'd been monitoring the authentication process through his system access. He didn't know we'd already resolved it when he made the call. Sorensen paused. "He told someone the connection was gone. The communication is now part of the record of his secondary contact." She looked at Evelyn directly. "He handed us the reach back." "To Brower." "We'll know more in 48 hours, Sorensen said. "But yes." It was not satisfaction that Evelyn felt sitting in that break room with a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm and a federal agent who delivered information with the efficiency of someone billing by the hour. It was something quieter than satisfaction and more durable. The specific feeling of a structure you've been holding in tension for a long time beginning to bear its own weight. She had built the case in the dark, alone, for 8 years. She had carried it through 2 relocations and a career rebuild, and 6 years of being systematically underestimated by men who had never once considered that the quiet nurse checking their charts might know things they didn't, might have seen things they couldn't imagine, might be exactly who she had always been, even in the absence of anyone acknowledging it. The structure held. Not because it was perfect. There were gaps, there were complications, there were things that would take months of legal process to fully resolve. But it held because she had built it to hold, with the precision of someone who understood that the truth, to be useful, had to be preserved carefully and presented correctly and timed right. She finished her tea and went back to work. 3 weeks passed in the way that consequential periods sometimes do, not slowly, but with a density that made each day feel like it contained more than its hours. Federal indictments were filed in the District of Colorado and the Eastern District of Virginia. Warren Holt, Meridian's CEO, was denied bail on the basis of flight risk. His passport had been flagged at Phoenix Sky Harbor the morning of his arrest, 40 minutes after the arrest itself. The indictment against Holt and 7 co-defendants ran to 63 pages and included wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States government, falsification of federal records, and a charge specific to the misuse of military contracting authority that Evelyn hadn't known existed as a statutory category until Sorensen explained it. Hollis was indicted on 3 counts: the consulting arrangement, the role in closing her complaint, and a separate charge related to falsified medical opinions that had been used to support clearance decisions. His attorney released a statement the morning the indictment was filed that used the word context 7 times. The statement did not appear to be helping. Sandra Kaur agreed to cooperate. Her testimony, when it eventually came, would take 2 days and cover the acquisition's approval chain in detail that her email correspondence had only suggested. The reach back to Brower's office, once Kaur confirmed it, was no longer circumstantial. Philip Brower resigned from the deputy secretary position on a Wednesday morning. The official statement cited personal reasons. The unofficial accounting, which leaked through 3 different news organizations within 48 hours, cited an ongoing federal investigation and the specific involvement of his office in a counterintelligence operation that had been used to suppress a legitimate internal complaint. He retained legal counsel the same afternoon. 2 of his staff were subpoenaed by end of week. Lane pleaded out in exchange for his cooperation on the reach-back documentation. He received a reduced charge and would serve time. The plea agreement required full disclosure of every access point he had exploited inside Redstone Memorial's systems, every communication he had forwarded, every document he had flagged for outside parties. The disclosure ran to 41 items across 4 years. Richard Alton resigned quietly. There was no statement. He was simply no longer in his position, and then he was named in a federal filing as a person of interest in the obstruction-related inquiry that had branched off from the main investigation, and then his attorney submitted paperwork that indicated he was cooperating with that inquiry in exchange for considerations that were not specified publicly. He was the kind of person who had spent 30 years ensuring that nothing was ever publicly specified, and in the end, the thing that brought him into the light was the same characteristic: the need to manage the situation from inside it, to appear in that hospital lobby and apply pressure in person, to be visible at the exact moment that visibility became evidence. Evelyn heard about most of this secondhand, through Sorensen's periodic updates and Dane's occasional calls and the news reports that she read the way she read everything, carefully, looking for the shape underneath the language, calibrating what was confirmed against what was being implied. She was busy. The morning of the 4th week, Margaret Voss called her into the boardroom. Voss was 62, compact, with the efficient manner of a person who had not reached her position by being vague about what she wanted. She sat across a table from Evelyn with 2 members of the board and the hospital's legal counsel, and a document that she slid across the table without preamble. "We're restoring your position in the emergency department," Voss said. "Full reinstatement, retroactive seniority from the date of the Hollis reassignment, and a formal acknowledgement in your personnel file that the reassignment was retaliatory and without clinical basis." Evelyn looked at the document. It was thorough. The legal counsel had done the work correctly. "There's a second component," Voss continued. "We're establishing a trauma education initiative at Redstone, mandatory clinical judgment training for emergency staff at all levels. We'd like you to lead it." A pause. "That would be a new position, senior clinical educator, trauma. You'd still carry patient care responsibilities, but the educational component would be formally structured." Evelyn looked up from the document. "Why me?" she said. Not deflection, an actual question. Voss met her eyes. "Because the thing this institution failed to do for 6 years was listen to someone who was right. The way we correct that is not just by acknowledging it on paper. It's by building a structure where people like you aren't ignored in the first place." She paused. "And frankly, because the physicians who currently need to sit through a clinical judgment training that was designed by you will understand exactly what that means." Evelyn thought about that, about the specific and not entirely comfortable satisfaction of that image. The attendings, the senior staff, the people who had said, "Stay in your lane and team fit, and I've been practicing for 22 years, sitting in a room where the framework for what it meant to see clearly and act on what you saw had been built by the nurse they had dismissed. It wasn't revenge. It was something more useful than revenge." "I'll need to design it myself," she said. "That's the expectation," Voss said. She signed the document. She called Marcus Webb that evening from her apartment, standing at the kitchen window with the mountains going dark in stages, the way they did this time of year. "Brower's gone," she said. "I heard," Marcus said. "How are you doing with it?" She thought about the question honestly, which was what Marcus had always required of her, and one of the reasons she trusted him. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I spent so long carrying the shape of this that I haven't figured out what I do without it." "You built something," he said. "That doesn't go away when the crisis goes away." "The crisis isn't fully away." "No, but you know what I mean." She did. The crisis, the active threat, the physical danger, the specific urgency of the last 4 days had resolved. The legal process would continue for months, possibly years, in the deliberate, document-heavy way of federal prosecution. But the thing she had been waiting for, the moment when the evidence she'd preserved connected to hands that could do something with it, had happened. The structure had held. The truth had moved from her fireproof box into the federal record, and once it was there, it could not be put back. "How's Roy?" Marcus asked. "His anticoagulation completed. He's walking well." She paused. "Atlas is in surgical recovery. The specialist says 6 to 8 weeks and he should be able to move without pain for the first time in 3 years. A silence on the line. Then, "Good." It was a small word for what it meant. She let it stand. She went back to the ER 2 weeks after the reinstatement documents were signed. The first morning back was not cinematic. The ward was busy. The handoff from the overnight team was complicated by a multi-vehicle accident that had come in at 5:40. and she walked into the controlled chaos of an active trauma bay and did her job without anyone stopping to mark the moment, because the moment didn't wait for marking. It was already happening, already demanding the next decision and the one after that. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The difference now was that when she flagged something, people listened. Not because they were required to, though the new clinical judgment protocol, which she had spent 3 weeks designing and which was now being implemented hospital-wide, did create formal accountability structures for exactly that. But because the building had a different relationship to her now, a revised understanding of what she was, and trust, once recalibrated, changes the texture of the everyday in ways that aren't dramatic but are cumulative and real. Doctor. Nadia Osei, who had come upstairs to check Roy Callahan's trend data without being asked and had ordered the ultrasound that caught the clot, became the person Evelyn worked most closely with in the new initiative. Osei was direct and not sentimental, and had strong opinions about what constituted good clinical decision-making, and she and Evelyn disagreed on approximately 30% of the curriculum design and resolved every disagreement by going back to the evidence, which was the only way either of them knew how to resolve anything. The first training session ran in the 3rd month. 12 attendings, 8 residents, the entire senior nursing cohort. Evelyn stood at the front of the room and was aware, briefly, of the specific geometry of the moment. The same people, the same institution, the same walls, and a completely different set of assumptions operating in the room. She noted it and then let it go, because dwelling on the geometry was its own kind of self-indulgence, and she had work to do. She taught for 3 hours. The curriculum was built around case studies, real scenarios, anonymized, in which clinical signals had been present and missed or dismissed. She did not build the curriculum around her own story. That would have been the wrong frame. She built it around the question of what you did when what you were seeing didn't match what you were being told to see, and how you held your ground without becoming so combative that the ground itself became the fight. That was the hardest lesson. She knew it from experience. Hollis's trial was set for 8 months out. In the interim, his operating privileges had been suspended pending the outcome of a separate medical board review. The review was not a formality. It was thorough, conducted by people who had no relationship to Redstone Memorial or to the events of the preceding months, and its outcome would be determined by the evidence of his clinical conduct independent of the federal charges. She was not involved in the medical board process. She had provided a written statement at the board's request, and that was the extent of her participation, because the board's job was the board's job, and she understood the importance of processes operating correctly in their own lanes, even when, especially when, the outcome mattered to her personally. Roy Callahan drove up from Pueblo 6 weeks after his discharge. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon unannounced, which was entirely consistent with what she'd come to understand about him, and he found her at the nursing station in the ER by the simple method of walking through the building until he located her. "You look different," he said. "I'm in a different ward," she said. "That's not what I mean." She looked at him. He'd healed well. He was moving without the careful compensation she'd seen in the observation ward. His color was better, and he had the alert, self-contained quality of a man who had processed what had happened to him and filed it in the correct place. "How's the knee?" she said. "Fine. How's the rest of it?" She thought about the question, about the indictments and the resignation and the evidence that had traveled from a fireproof box in Durango into a federal record that would exist and be referenced and mean something for as long as the legal system that held it continued to function. About Lane and Alton and Brower's empty office. About the curriculum she was building and the sessions she was running and the particular quiet revolution of a room where a senior surgeon sat and listened carefully to what she was saying because the institution had established, formally and publicly, that she was worth listening to. "Better," she said. She meant it. Roy nodded. "Atlas is doing the same." He paused. "The surgeon says his mobility at 6 weeks is ahead of projection. He's not in pain." She felt something shift in her chest at that. Not sorrow, not exactly relief, but the specific emotion of learning that a thing has been undone that should not have been done in the first place, and that the undoing has worked, and that an animal who was quiet and trusting and did not understand why he hurt has stopped hurting. It was not a complicated feeling. It was one of the cleanest feelings she'd had in a long time. "Good," she said. Roy studied her for a moment with the same direct attention he'd shown from the first day. "Dennis wants to bring him in," he said. "Atlas." Wanted to know if that would be okay. It's a hospital. You know what I mean. She did. Yes, she said. It would be okay. Dennis arrived 20 minutes later. Atlas came through the ER doors at a controlled walk, the working vest still on because it helped him navigate public spaces, the scar on his shoulder visible where the fur had grown back at a slightly different angle over the surgical site. He moved differently than he had the first time, not the barely compensated favoring she now recognized in retrospect, but a freer movement, each step with its full range, the body of an animal that had been given back to itself. He walked through the ward without hurrying, the same deliberate attention as before, the same scanning movement of head and ears. Staff stepped aside or stopped to watch. A resident who'd been mid-briefing fell quiet. The ER, which was always loud and always moving, did one of its rare involuntary pauses. Atlas stopped in front of Evelyn. He looked at her for a moment, the same direct eye contact he'd offered from the beginning, the same quality of recognition that had no explanation that fit neatly into clinical language and didn't need one. Then he stepped forward and placed his head against her hands. Both of them, crossed in front of her, the way she'd been standing, and was still. The ER stayed quiet. Not because anyone had asked it to, not because there was a protocol for this moment or a designated place in the shift schedule for it. It went quiet because people who work in emergency medicine develop, over time, an instinct for recognizing when something significant is happening in front of them. And this was significant, and they knew it, and they stopped. She put her hands on either side of Atlas's face and looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, Dennis was not quite managing to maintain a neutral expression. Roy had his arms crossed and was looking at the middle distance with the focused attention of a man feeling something he'd decided not to show. Russell Dade, who had appeared from somewhere without her noticing, stood at the edge of the group with the expression of a person who had done a small good thing under difficult circumstances and was quietly glad it had mattered. Petra was there, the resident who'd stopped mid-briefing. 2 nurses from the overnight team who hadn't left yet. Dr. Osei, who had come out of a bay at the sound of the silence because silence in an ER means either nothing or everything, and she'd wanted to know which. Evelyn looked at all of them and felt simply that she was where she was supposed to be. Not because it had been easy or because the institution had treated her well. It hadn't, for a long time, and that had been real, and it had cost her things she couldn't fully account for. But because the work itself had always been real, and the people she served had always been real, and she had never stopped being good at it even when everyone around her was committed to pretending otherwise. That was the thing nobody told you when they were busy underestimating you. The competence doesn't wait for the recognition. It exists independently. It saves lives in the quiet, in the margins of shifts, in the small catches and the flagged charts, and the trend data pulled at 2 in the morning, not because anyone asked, but because you saw something that needed to be seen. The recognition, when it finally came, it didn't create the competence. It just stopped hiding it. She thought about the people whose names were now in federal filings, Holt and Hollis and Lane and Core and the others, and she thought about the dogs who had been cleared despite their injuries, who had worked past the point of pain because they trusted the structure that had failed them. And she thought about what it cost a person to carry something true through years of being told it wasn't. She had carried it. She had kept it intact. She had waited for the moment when the truth could move from her hands into the world. And when that moment came, she had been ready because she had never once, in all those years, allowed herself to stop being ready. That was not heroism. That was just refusal. The refusal to let the institutional weight of being dismissed add up to the belief that you deserved dismissal. The quiet, daily, unglamorous decision to know what you know even when the room tells you otherwise. She lifted her hands from Atlas's face and straightened up, and the ER came back to itself. The monitors, the voices, the necessary noise of a place that could not stay still. And she picked up the next chart and looked at what it needed. She got to work. Some people spend years being the most capable person in the room while everyone in the room looks past them. If you're one of those people, understand this. The looking past is not evidence. It is not data. It is not a verdict. It is a failure of attention by people who have not yet been required to pay it. Your job is not to make them see you. Your job is to be ready for the moment when the truth becomes impossible to ignore, and to have held it carefully enough that when that moment comes, it is still intact. Evelyn Marsh waited 8 years. She kept the box. She stayed ready. And when the moment came, everything she had preserved, every document, every date, every careful notation in a margin, was exactly where she had put it, undamaged, complete, and sufficient. That is what quiet strength looks like from the inside. Not peace, not patience, preparation, and the absolute refusal to become someone smaller than you are just because the room hasn't figured out your size yet.